Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to unpack some complex issues using the sources you've sent over.
Exactly.
And since it's Philosophy Friday, I know you're the kind of listener who likes to, really dig into how things work behind the scenes.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what we're setting out to do today.
Yeah, and we've got some really fascinating material analyses on control in democracies, media comparisons, bits from Necessary Illusions.
Okay.
And the goal really is to explore how how it shapes what we think is true about events, about concepts.
Right. So let's start with something that really jumped out from the sources. This idea of the sanctity of borders.
Ah, yes.
Seems clear enough, doesn't it? Respect borders. But the sources suggest it's maybe not applied that consistently.
No, not at all, actually. What the sources point to is a very selective application. Powerful states, they don't seem to treat it as this absolute rule. It's more about, their own political interests.
There was that specific contrast mentioned, wasn't there? The strong reaction when Nicaragua chased Contra forces into Honduras.
Oh, huge condemnation internationally. A major violation, supposedly.
But then you look at, say, Israeli actions in southern Lebanon, setting up that security zone.
And the reaction for those same powerful nations, much more muted, less outrage, definitely not the same level of official censure.
It really makes you pause, Is the principle the main thing, or is it who is crossing the border? What does that difference tell us?
Well, the conclusion drawn in these texts is that the underlying driver is often about protecting and advancing, their own interests.
And their allies' interests.
And their allies' interest, precisely. Less about universal law, more about political goals.
Which kind of leads into another point from the sources, how thought itself can be, managed, even in democracies, not through outright banning things, but interpretation.
Exactly. It's subtle. You use these loaded terms. Think about words like democracy, freedom, even terrorism.
They pack a punch, those words.
They do. But how they're applied, that seems to shift depending on who's doing the action and, frankly, who's doing the labeling.
Have you ever noticed that? How the same kind of action gets praised one way.
Yeah, defending democracy.
And then condemned another way if it's someone else doing it.
Absolutely. The sources argue this is strategic. If it's us or our allies, it's framed positively.
But if it's an adversary?
Then the language is completely different, negative. It forces you to ask, is it the action or the actor that determines the label?
Which ties into narratives, right? The whole heroes and devils thing the sources talk about, simplifying things.
Yeah, making it very black and white. Good versus evil.
Like a storybook.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
A Manichaean portrayal, they call it. You're either purely good or purely evil, and that often depends on whether you line up with elite interests.
And the result of that kind of storytelling, for us, the audience.
Well, the argument is it hinders critical thinking, big time.
How so?
Because if everything's presented as simple good versus evil, you stop looking for the gray areas, the nuances, the other perspectives. Think about a news story you saw recently with really clear good guys and bad guys. Was it really that simple? Could there have been more to it?
That points towards something bigger. This propaganda model mentioned in the sources sounds pretty fundamental.
It's a key argument, yeah.
Yeah.
The core idea is that major media, particularly the big influential outlets, they function like corporations.
Okay.
And their main business, essentially, is selling audiences, specifically privileged, affluent audiences, to advertisers.
So it's not just about informing people. There's this huge commercial pressure.
That's the crux of it, and the implication. The picture of the world they present might naturally reflect the interests and perspectives of the media owners, the advertisers, and the target audience they're selling.
And this is happening while media ownership gets more and more concentrated. Fewer companies owning more outlets.
Exactly. Plus, the people running these media companies, the top editors, the prominent commentators, they often come from similar backgrounds. Privileged elites sharing similar worldviews.
So maybe not an explicit conspiracy, but like a structural bias built into the system.
That's the idea. And think about journalists trying to build a career in that system. The path of least resistance is often to internalize those values, to conform to those pressures, maybe without even realizing it. Rocking the boat consistently can be, difficult.
And advertisers can exert direct pressure too, right? There was that example, a documentary critical of multinationals, and suddenly the funding gets pulled.
Yes, that WNET example with Gulf plus Western.
Yeah.
It's a stark illustration. As one source put it, projects unsuitable for corporate sponsorship tend to die in the vine.
Wow.
The warning doesn't have to be explicit. It's often just understood.
And it's interesting how the sources say critiques of this model within the mainstream media itself are often just dismissed, not really engaged with.
Right. It's sort of self-protecting, isn't it? The idea that the media itself could have this systemic bias is often treated as, you know, fringe or conspiratorial, not worthy of serious debate. A blind spot, maybe?
This isn't exactly new, though, is it? The sources mention historical stuff. Necessary illusions.
Oh, absolutely. Creating narratives to manage populations goes way back. Think about 1917, the Bolsheviks and agitprop. Even revolutionary movements use these tools.
And that term, the people, it didn't always mean everyone, did it?
Not according to historian Richard Morris, no. When someone like Alexander Hamilton said, the people, he apparently meant a pretty small slice, white, wealthy, nationalist men, basically, not the general population.
The sources gave some pretty clear examples of this historical framing, like how Central American countries were described.
Yeah, fledgling democracies, even if they were run by the military or business elites. Compare that to communist Nicaragua.
Which was framed as the threat.
Exactly. And they mentioned suppressing polls in El Salvador that showed people didn't really feel they had democracy or freedom. That kind of information didn't fit the preferred narrative.
And that Honduran newspaper, El Tiempo, describing their own situation as unemployment and repression under U.S. and Contra occupation, you didn't hear that perspective much in the U.S. media.
No. Which raises the question, who defines these terms? And you had thinkers like Lasswell and Niebuhr actually arguing that elites should use propaganda because, well, they believed the masses were irrational and couldn't figure out their own best interests.
That sounds incredibly condescending.
It's a very paternalistic view, isn't it?
Yeah.
We know best, so we need to create these necessary illusions for your own good.
What do you make of that core assumption about people's intelligence?
Well, that's the bedrock of it, according to these analyses. Even after WWII, historian Thomas Bailey apparently said statesmen might need to deceive the public about their long-run interests. And Samuel Huntington's suggested selling interventions by creating a misimpression, like pretending you're fighting the Soviets when the real target is different.
It feeds into this idea of a kind of state religion in the West, centered on free enterprise, where keeping the public a bit ignorant is actually seen as helpful for stability.
Yeah, the underlying thought seems to be that the public just can't handle the truth or can't make sound judgments, so they need guiding or managing.
The specific case studies really come at home, like Afghanistan versus Vietnam.
Huge contrast in coverage. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, brutal aggression universally condemned.
Right.
U.S. involvement in South Vietnam, framed as resisting aggression, defending democracy, even while backing dictators and using massive force. Very different language.
And the treatment of the Sandinistas in Nicaragua compared to U.S. allies in the region. That Washington Post quote about needing to hound the Sandinistas.
Hound them for democracy while kind of ignoring the lack of it in U.S.-backed states that were, frankly, committing terrible atrocities.
And positive reports about Nicaragua, say from Oxfam on social programs, they were downplayed or ignored.
Largely suppressed, according to the sources. While negative stories, especially those aligning with U.S. policy aims, got amplified, it's about selection.
The El Salvador example, too. Rebels as Marxist terrorists, the government leader as Honorable Mr. Duarte.
Right, in outlets like the New York Times. Even though the government and military were responsible for widespread killing, that often got minimized or omitted. Makes you wonder what wasn't being reported.
And even UN resolutions, if they criticize the Soviets, big news. If they criticize the U.S. or Israel.
Often ignored or buried on the back pages. A clear pattern of selective attention.
Even the PLO stuff, their Declaration of Independence, maybe accepting a two-state deal. That seemed downplayed.
Yeah, the focus shifted more towards U.S. and Israeli rejectionism, rather than exploring the potential opening for peace. You have to ask, why amplify one narrative over the other?
Then there's the whole Esquipulas Accords thing. The U.S. apparently working against it while blaming Nicaragua.
Exactly. And the huge media focus on, say, the Sandinistas shutting down a radio station temporarily, or reacting to a pro-Contra rally. Compared to the relative silence on massacres and systematic torture in El Salvador or Guatemala, states heavily backed by the U.S. The scale of outrage seemed completely disproportionate.
The language used, too. Different words for similar actions depending on who was doing it.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Loaded terms for Nicaragua, more neutral or even positive framing for allies. And the funding, lots of focus on U.S. money going to Nicaraguan opposition groups with little support.
But similar interference elsewhere wasn't such a big story.
Often downplayed, yeah. It raises questions about consistency, doesn't it? Applying principles like non-interference selectively.
So, the rules of democracy, peace accords, seemed like they were applied with a double standard, much harsher scrutiny on Nicaragua.
That's the argument presented. And the media outrage followed that pattern, focusing intensely on Sandinista actions, while often minimizing far worse human rights abuses by U.S. clients.
And this selective framing extends to the concept of terrorism itself, particularly under Reagan. What was the deal there?
Well, the sources say international terrorism became this huge focus, and the Soviet Union was labeled the root cause, the sponsor.
Okay.
But this framing also allowed the U.S. to create what the sources call little Satans, weaker adversaries like Libya or Nicaragua, who could be targeted to show toughness without risking a direct fight with the Soviets.
In the definition of terrorism, it wasn't applied evenly.
Often conveniently excluded state actions by the U.S. or its allies, like Israel. Think about how violence was described. It really depended on who was the perpetrator and who was the victim.
Right. Israeli actions versus Contra actions might be framed very differently, and things like the U.S. role in that 1985 Beirut car bombing.
Received far less sustained attention and condemnation than acts attributed to official enemies. There was a clear imbalance in coverage.
And Camp David. Taking Egypt out of the Arab-Israeli equation? How did that affect things?
The argument is it freed Israel up, militarily, particularly in Lebanon, leading to invasions and occupations with, relatively speaking, less critical media scrutiny than might otherwise have occurred.
And the PLO, their moves towards politics were seen as a threat, more than their violence.
Sometimes, yes. The sources suggest that a PLO committed to a political settlement that the U.S. and Israel didn't like was actually perceived as more dangerous than PLO terrorism, which could be used to justify avoiding such a settlement.
That's quite a claim. It suggests the goal wasn't necessarily just peace.
It suggests the preferred kind of peace was very specific, and anything deviating from that was a problem. Which brings us to the media bias specifically around the Arab-Israeli conflict.
Yeah, the common narrative. U.S. and Israel want peace. Palestinian terror is the obstacle. What's missing there, according to the sources?
Quite a bit, apparently. Instances where Israel rejected peace offers with wide international backing, for example. That context often gets left out, which shapes how you see the ongoing conflict.
And the underlying assumptions about rights.
There's often a tacit assumption, the sources argue, that the indigenous Palestinians don't quite have the same rights as Jewish immigrants settling the land. It's rarely stated outright, but it underpins much of the discourse.
And criticizing Israeli policy gets equated with anti-Semitism.
That's a frequent tactic highlighted in the sources. It shuts down debate. Meanwhile, actual anti-Semitic associations by figures aligned with Israeli power might get downplayed or excused.
Like that comparison between alleged anti-Semitism in the Democratic Party versus actual Nazi sympathizers linked to the Bush campaign.
Exactly. A clear double standard in how accusations were treated. Or the story of Mordecai Vanunu, the nuclear whistleblower abducted by Israel.
Limited coverage of that.
Very limited in major U.S. media, considering the implications. Why was that story not deemed more significant? So, the overall framework for discussing the media's role here is often limited. It's usually framed as attacks on the media for being anti-Israel versus defenses of its objectivity.
With little room for the idea that the bias might actually be pro-Israel.
Exactly. That possibility is often outside the accepted bounds of the debate. Even discussions about media coverage tend to focus on perceived unfairness to Israel.
Okay, last big theme. Freedom of speech. Even in democracies, it's not absolute.
No. The sources point out that while you have constitutional protections, there's a history of suppression, especially during perceived crises, like Wilson's Red Scare. And the legal doctrine often distinguishes between prior restraint stopping publication beforehand, which is hard to do, and punishment after the fact for saying the wrong thing.
And powerful groups tend to protect the rights they benefit most from.
That's the argument. And you even have thinkers like Genter Louis arguing the state should actively intervene in the marketplace of ideas.
To do what?
To protect the public from subversive ideas, to energize democratic forces, even against groups operating legally but deemed ideologically problematic.
Like those church groups opposing Vietnam, he saw a hidden agenda.
Yes, that example shows a desire to control not just what people do, but what they think and why. It reveals a potential limit to tolerance for dissent, even when it's peaceful and lawful.
It really shows that tension, doesn't it, between free speech ideals and the desire of those in power to maintain control over the narrative.
Absolutely.
Wow. Okay, so wrapping this deep dive up, We've seen how principles like border sanctity can be applied selectively, how language shapes thought, how media narratives simplify the role of ownership and advertising.
And lots of specific examples, historical and more recent, showing how dominant narratives get built and defended, often by ignoring or downplaying inconvenient facts or alternative perspectives.
And for everyone listening, especially on Philosophy Friday, you can see how all this stuff directly impacts our grasp of big ideas like justice, democracy, how nations relate to each other. It's not just abstract theory.
Not at all. It's about the lens through which we see the world.
So maybe the final thought for everyone to take away is this. Knowing all this, how do you approach the news, the information you see every day differently? What questions will you start asking now? About the source, the words they use, whose perspective is front and center, and whose might be missing.
Yeah, it definitely gives you a new toolkit for analysis, something to keep thinking about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.